Yeah, it was a big topic of conversation at World Travel Market this year. In fact, when you looked at the marketing summit, the best attended sessions were the ones where AI was the topic of conversation, and that's because AI isn't just changing search; it's rewriting all the rules around trust, booking, brand visibility. The funnel is collapsing into this conversation with AI.
Hmm.
And whoever owns that conversation. Owns the traveler.
Most marketers are still following old playbooks written decades ago. The rules have changed, but the advice hasn't. Flipping the playbook is your license to rebel. This is your front row seat to finding out how leading CMOs are tearing up the old rules and building strategies that move the needle. If you're tired of being told that this is how it's done, let's flip the playbook together. Here's your host, Reza Mayandin.
Travel marketing is entering a new era. Discovery is becoming less predictable. AI is reshaping how travelers research destinations, and trust signals increasingly determine which brands win the booking. To succeed, it's time for travel marketeers to flip the playbook on discovery, trust, and the modern customer journey. My guest today is Matthew Gardiner, a fractional marketing leader and a growth partners to travel brands and destinations. He's led marketing and e-commerce functions inside FTSE 100 companies and international organizations across the globe. He's the ideal person to talk to. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Reza, and thank you for the kind introduction.
For anyone who doesn't know who you are, what's your story in travel marketing and what are you doing day to day now?
Yeah, I started my career working for a luxury tour operator. Then I gained experience across hotel and leisure brands and in travel recruitment. I then spent 6 years inside International Airlines Group, owner of British Airways and Iberia, where I led global marketing and communications for their cargo business. That was a role that had me at the heart of aviation during COVID, which was an extraordinary leadership experience. We were navigating crisis, reinventing how the business worked, and still, achieving record cargo revenues. Since then, my career has progressed into a more advisory capacity, working with travel brands, tourist boards, travel technology companies on growth, brand positioning, go-to-marketing strategy. Alongside that, I run Travel Massive in London, which brings together tens of thousands of people from across the travel ecosystem. I also support the Education and Training Committee of the Institute of Travel and Tourism, which of course, Reza, is how you and I first met. And for the last 2 years, I've also worked as a content advisor to World Travel Market and was the host of the WTM Marketing Summit in 24 and 25. Day to day, my work's really about helping travel businesses answer that, that big question of, how do they generate growth? How do they differentiate and stay relevant in one of the most competitive and fascinating industries in the world?
Yeah, that's correct. And you touched on that. You run Travel Massive London, which technically puts you in the middle of the industry globally. What is the recurring conversation you keep hearing from the travel marketeers right now?
Oh, I mean, Travel Massive is a wonderful community and something I could, take this whole episode up talking to you about. It's now over 80,000 people worldwide, part of that community, with London being our biggest chapter. So you're right, it gives me a pretty good pulse of what the industry's thinking. And one thing I think I've noticed again and again is how much marketers value peer-to-peer insights. The industry, as you kind of hinted at in your introduction, is navigating big shifts. AI changing discovery patterns, obviously lots of geopolitical uncertainty, and what people are really looking for and what marketers are looking for is perspectives from other marketers, people who are going through the same challenges as they are. And that's why communities have become so powerful, because sometimes the most useful insights don't come from a a report or a conference stage. It comes from, another marketer saying, we've tried this. This is how it played out. So the recurring conversations that I hear is really about collaborative learning.
Mhm. Okay. And when it comes to collaborative learning and you being a leader and other leaders also talking to you, how do you end up leading people with clarity and confidence when the industry you're isn't changing all the time and constantly changing?
Leadership in a fast changing industry is about two things, clarity of purpose and then psychological safety for experimentation. You have to give teams a very clear sense of what you're trying to achieve, the commercial goals, the brand direction, the customers that you want to win, but you also have to acknowledge that the path to get there will keep evolving. When I was leading global marketing during COVID, the playbook changed daily. What kept the team focused wasn't pretending we had all the answers. It was being honest about the uncertainty while staying very clear on the mission. Great teams don't need perfect certainty. They need a leader who says, this is where we're going, this is where we are, and this is how we're going to keep moving forward and learning together. If you create that environment, people become much more, much braver and more innovative.
Absolutely. You touch point on psychological safety, and it's an incredible thing if you can create that environment. And in the world of marketing, because things change so much,
Yeah.
sometimes that psychological safety often gets forgotten. And bring that a little bit more to life for me. How can marketeers and marketing leaders do that? Like, if you were to give it in a 2-minute touch point, quick turnaround of it.
I, you know, a lot of the conversations that you and I have are, around obviously technology. Technology is one of the biggest changing things at the moment that marketers are having to contend with. So, you look at that, how do you evolve your team's capabilities without creating fear or fatigue, you know, within that psychological, safety environment? And, that's where leadership really matters. When technology shifts quickly, it's very easy for teams to feel overwhelmed or worried that their skills are going to become obsolete. So, to answer your question, the most important thing that a leader can do to create psychological safety is to reframe that conversation. AI is not replacing marketers. The fundamentals of marketing still matter enormously. Understanding human motivation, telling compelling stories, building brands that people trust. What changes and what is changing is the toolkit. So the way I approach it with teams is to create that culture of experimentation, encourage people to play with the tools, run small tests, share what they learn. And I guess the other key thing in that is then, you celebrate curiosity, because the truth is that organizations that adapt fastest won't be the ones with best technology. They're going to be the ones that, they're going to be the ones with the most curious teams.
Yes.
And curiosity is a much more powerful motivator than fear is.
Of course, that's 100% true. Thank you for bringing that to life, because it is a very difficult position to be, especially in the travel industry, and everything just changes all the time. Even to
Yes,
this
it does
day,
indeed.
as months go on, we had COVID before, and now we have something else, and we're gonna have something else as it comes.
Yeah.
It's not the most consistent thing, and new destinations happen, etc.,
Yeah.
etc., and new technologies come.
Whilst you say that, Reza, though, the desire to travel is one of the most stable forces in consumer behavior. Travel demand is very resilient, even in an uncertain world.
When we are talking about changes in the world, What do you think has changed the most in the last couple of years in how people discover and find destinations for travel?
It's the biggest shift in the last couple of years has been that, discovery is becoming more conversational. Historically, travel planning followed a, fairly linear path, inspiration, research, comparison, booking. AI is starting to compress that, and change that journey quite dramatically.
Mhm. And and how does that affect the decision making part? So, do we think the friction point between getting inspired to travel and booking has changed? What's the biggest friction point in your opinion?
I guess that the biggest friction point is confidence. There is no shortage of inspiration. There's, social media creators, films, and, TV is, and films are really, there's been a big trend in how that directs where people will travel to. People are constantly discovering new places that they want to go. The problem is what happens next. Once travelers move from dreaming to booking, suddenly they are faced with a overwhelming number of options, which airline, which hotel, which platform, which itinerary. So, the role of travel marketing today isn't just about inspiration, it's about reducing the uncertainty of that choice, and the brands that, the ones that move from simply inspiring to guiding them through a channel, helping travelers feel confident that this is the right trip, this is the right moment. Um, you know, because you know, re- ultimately a booking happens at a moment when that inspiration that we're talking about here, you know, turns into confidence.
Yeah, of course. Um, and talking about social media or other platforms that do inspire, I want to come to the core one that's currently everybody talks about, uh, uh, AI. And how do you think AI and chatbots assistants really change travel discovery in practical terms? What's going to get
Mm.
discussed first?
Yeah, it was a big topic of conversation at World Travel Market this year. In fact, when you looked at the marketing summit, the best attended sessions were the ones where AI was, the topic of conversation. And, that's because AI isn't just changing search, it's rewriting all the rules around trust, booking, brand visibility. As I kind of mentioned a moment ago, that the funnel is collapsing into this conversation with AI, you know, and whoever owns that conversation um, owns the traveler. For years, pretty much ever since I've been in travel, the fight with OTA, so online travel agencies versus direct.
Yes.
Um, Now, increasingly, the fight is, can you even get surfaced in AI? You know, and I think to that point, voice of place matters again. You know, Travelers aren't asking flights to Rome. They're asking, what's the best place for a 4-day trip with kids in October where it's warm, not too crowded, and destinations really need to sort of be answering at that level.
Yeah. And what do you think then travel brands need to do to become the recommended option inside AI-led journeys?
Yeah. I mean, to be recommended in an AI-led journey, um, travel brands really need three things. It's clarity, credibility, and structured information. Um, they're probably the top sort of three big categories. First and clarity. Um, AI systems are answering very specific questions. So brands need to know exactly, what they're for. And, they need to have a much, yeah, and if they have that, then they have a much better chance of surfacing in AI. Then second with, credibility. Um, AI models obviously draw on signals from across the web, reviews, um, media coverage, creator content. Um, So the more trusted your references and, and more trust your brand has, the more likely it is to be recommended, which, as a side note is one reason why travel brands should probably be spending more on PR. And particularly when you look at the, uh, um, Dan Christian, who you and I both know, was talking about this at WTM, where, um, one of the key things is the relevance, the recency, of a lot of the sources um, that are recommending and referencing you. So again, that's another argument for why you should be in market from a PR point of view right now. And the third thing I mentioned, of course, is structured content. Content and product data needs to be organized in a way that matches, easily be understood and synthesized by, by machines.
Okay, all right. And do you think then, as this journey changes, you might see winner takes most effect in travel? A few brands dominate the attention, or does AI open up the door for challenges?
Oh, it's a really interesting question, Reza. Really interesting question. I suspect that we will see a bit of both. AI systems, as we've just talked about, do tend to recommend, things that are trusted, well reviewed, well referenced. And that naturally, of course, favors established brands. But at the same time, AI can surface niche specialists much more effectively than traditional search does. So, if someone asks, best eco lodges in Costa Rica or um, cycling holidays in Oman, AI doesn't necessarily default to the biggest brand. The AI systems are looking for the most relevant one. So, in some ways, AI may actually, um, it kind of rewards clarity of positioning, I guess, rather than sheer scale. So the danger for a brand is being too generic. If your proposition is vague, um, if your proposition is vague, you're unlikely to be the best answer to any specific question. But so if you're distinctive, specialized, trusted, AI may actually amplify you. I don't like making predictions about AI. The future,
AI
but
doesn't
the
have to
future
make
probably
predictions.
isn't AI. Probably to your question, the future probably isn't winner takes all. It's probably the winner takes a category. I'm gonna, you're interviewing me, but I'm going to ask you the question because what's your view, Reza? Do you disagree with what I've just said, or I was hedging my
No,
bets
I don't.
last week?
I don't disagree. If you're a super specialist, let's pick, for example, a holiday destination company that really focuses on a specific destination,
Yeah.
and they know the ins and outs of the destination. In my experience, they can resurface and they can actually compete quite well. Specifically because they know the details. They know the corner shop. They know
Yeah.
which restaurant is the best, and they can give you the details about it being good,
Yeah.
and they bring that to life. And if they can do that, AI will go, this person always talks about it here, he's got these details, and certainly is most likely to prove the case, because at the end of the day, in my opinion, and as you've said, AI wants to give the best result and reduce that friction point, reduce the discoverability. So it makes the difference. Well, that's the answer to your question. Well, I'm being interviewed now. Now, moving on from that, travel is naturally a higher spend and high stakes. What are the trust cues that genuinely moves conversion today? So talking about discovery point, now moving into the trust cues.
Yeah. Well, travel is one of the most emotional purchases people make, and it is also one of the most expensive purchases people make. So trust does play a huge role in conversion. And, I guess what's interesting is that trust isn't built through one signal. It's built through, a stack of signals. There's professional photography, of course, creator content, your sort of general brand reputation, payment security, sexy things like flexible booking policies, and it's about getting all that stuff working together. So one of the clients I'm working with at the moment, Stage 22, one of the things that, I've seen through Stage 22, is that powerful, how powerful contextual trust can be. So, when travelers see accommodation options directly inside content, um, the content that inspired the trip, a blog, an itinerary, a creative video, conversion rates there often, increase dramatically, because the recommendation is embedded in the story rather than just interrupting it. And of course, the nature of that content actually also skews it significantly towards how likely it is to convert. But trust is less about one big brand message. It's about multiple small signals that quietly reassure a traveler that the choice is safe, smart, and that it's worth the money.
Absolutely. No, that's a very, very, very good point in terms of, and I've not actually heard that before about the location within the content that has increased the conversion rate. So that's really, really good. Is there any other parts where you've seen conversion rate increasing without touching the price? Is there things that you would change first?
Um, the first thing I would look at if I wanted to shift conversion rate without, touching price, obviously adjusting your price is the easiest way to,
Yes.
but let's say revenue management stop you from doing that. The first thing I would look at is decision friction. Travel bookings are often incredibly complex, and, people have lots of tabs. They're looking at comparison sites, unclear policies, there's hidden fees. You get to the end of your journey, you're like, oh, great, now I've got to pay for it. Every moment of uncertainty, reduces the chance of a conversion. So, the most powerful thing you can do is simplify decision making. Make the value clear, make the product easy to compare, and make the policies transparent. Don't hide those away. And I think one of the most interesting insights from the creator community that we've touched on, again, to plug Stage 22, is, right in the middle of that, when travelers encounter bookable options within the context of trusted content, the booking journey suddenly feels shorter. It feels more intuitive. If the traveler's already decided they want to go, it's about the platform removing the steps between inspiration and action, So yeah, if I picked out one thing, it's, reducing friction in the journey. The best brands are usually the ones that, make a decision feel easiest.
That's incredible. And do you feel like reviews, creators, UGC, the real people content help most? And also, has there been times where you've seen it backfire?
I mean, reviews and real world content, can be incredibly powerful. It kind of bridges that gap between, the aspiration and the reality. And it, uh, beautiful photography, etc., inspires people, but reviews, the content, user generated content, that helps travelers imagine themselves actually taking that trip. And it's especially powerful when someone has chosen a destination but is deciding where to stay, what to do when they're there. So yeah, there's hugely valuable to, get that sort of authentic content out there. Particularly when people are, where intent is very high. Where has it backfired? Mistakes. I mean, the risk comes, in my view, when brands over-engineer it, because ultimately, the most persuasive travel marketing is, it's not what brands say, it is what travelers, say to each other. I've always thought destination marketing is actually a particularly interesting area that here, when you're a tourist board, because you are promoting a destination, but you don't actually own the value proposition. You're not the one fulfilling the the actual travel product offering. And
Although
there,
experience
in terms of,
that.
yeah, you just got to give people like the freedom to go out and
Yeah, of course.
and make noise.
I want to bring our conversation into brand versus performance. And often I see they kind of conflict sometimes within the in-house. Where do travel teams most commonly get the brand versus performance balance wrong in your experience?
Well, I think whether it's to that point, almost framed in your question, about them competing, and that is, almost the biggest mistake that travel teams do make, treating brand and performance as competing strategies where really they are two parts of the same growth engine, Um, in travel in particular, what often happens is, the short term booking pressures push teams towards the performance channels. We see, search, retargeting affiliates, um, is the direction that travel brands going. And, those channels can work incredibly well until they don't, because, you can only harvest demand, there's only so much demand you can harvest and, until I guess the field runs dry, and the brands that outperform over time are the ones, investing in fame, in emotional connections, the things that, make someone search for a brand rather than just, cheap flights to Spain. I attended the CIM Travel Industry Group Question Time event the other night, and there was a really good panel there on why travel brands must invest in awareness to win in the long term. Lots of really good figures coming out of that was specific to the travel industry, but um, decades of IPA research, have shown that marketing effectiveness is maximized when approximately, 60% of your investments on brand, 40% is on, short-term activation. Travel brands have really retreated to performance media. There were brands there that are talking about, spending, 5 to 10% on brand. The only brand on that panel that operated in the realm of that, 60-40 split was Sandals. Their marketing director, Jenny Sowerby, clearly doing a great job of framing brand not as a isolated cost, but a ecosystem multiplier. I'll probably misquote her slightly, but, she was saying, they can, at Sandals, consistently see that when brand health improves, also the performance channels, become much more efficient. And I think that's something that people forget, and there was some great data of that again about, as your brand gets, recognized, your performance or marketing, might return at 2.5 times the amount when you're at that sort of, when you're getting towards that split.
Oh, no, that's incredible. And what metrics do you actually trust to prove brand is driving commercial outcomes?
Oh,
It's
the
a hard
question that
question. I know.
the question that every CFO asked. Um, there's been numerous researchers have shown that, brand growth tends to show up first in, things like share of search, your direct traffic, brand search volumes, improvements in conversion efficiency, across your performance channels. So if you don't have a big insights team or you don't have brand research agency, they're the places to look to see the impact of brand turn up quickly. Because, when brand strength increases, to Jenny's point on the panel the other day, two things happen. More people start looking for you specifically, and your paid, channels work harder. I guess one of the things that I've learned, though, is every brand, though, also has its own proof point. So when I was leading marketing for International Airlines Group's cargo business, one of the things that I decided to heavily focus on was how our customers perceived the strength of our global network. The scale, the reach, the connectivity of it, because in aviation and logistics, that's a huge part of the value proposition, much, much more so than it is in on the passenger side of the business. So alongside traditional metrics, we tracked perception of our network, versus our competitors. And over time, as we made, brand investment increased, we saw that perception shift. And that translated directly into stronger commercial conversations with customers. So, you know, yes, science metrics matter, but sometimes, I guess the clearest sign a brand is working is when, the things that make your business special, like the scope of the network we had, when that starts showing up more strongly in the minds of your customers, in the conversations you're having with your customers.
So of course, and the reality is we could talk about our full 12 months when it comes to brand performance and still get a solid answer. Um, Going back to talking about teams, and
Mm.
as discovery is becoming more dynamic and less predictable, how do you evolve your team's capabilities without creating that fear of fatigue, especially in the world of AI?
Yeah, it comes back to that. I guess that earlier message, which is, um, AI is not replacing marketers. The fundamentals of marketing absolutely stand. It's just the toolkit which is changing. So, it is about reframing a conversation with your team. Um, you know, they are as important and as relevant as ever. The toolkit's changing, the mission's the same. And, we have to keep evolving and learning with that. And we learn and evolve together.
Looking ahead to the next 12 to 18 months, what will be the best travel marketing teams be doing that the average teams won't?
You're asking all the tough questions today. Um, I think the best travel marketing teams, there's probably three main things that they will do differently. Firstly, they're going to understand how to show up in AI discovery. Something we've obviously talked quite a lot about this morning, making sure their brand, their product data, their content, that is visible inside the engines. And it's not just about traditional search anymore. Um, Secondly, they will invest more seriously in audiences and communities. Making sure that you're not just dependent on search. Email marketing, loyalty programs, creator ecosystems, and customer communities. All that stuff is becoming more and more valuable. And it reduces your dependency on paid platforms. Um, And I guess, the third, and maybe you led me with your last question about teams is, the answer is definitely there's a cultural piece rather than just a technical piece. The best teams are built on cultures of experimentation. The pace of change, oh, you know, right now means that no one has the perfect playbook, and the teams that win will be, the ones running those small tests, the ones that are learning quickly, the ones that are, sharing their learnings as well across the organization. Technology matters, but mindset matters so much more because in the next phase of travel marketing, the competitive advantage isn't about budget. It's not about technology. It's going to be about adaptability. Um, you know, yeah. Those is the best marketing teams are going to be those you can adapt.
Thank you so much, Matthew. We've come to the end of the show. This has been Matthew Gardiner flipping the playbook with us. Thank you so much again. You can find Matthew on LinkedIn, and in his LinkedIn will be shown in the show notes. But really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Reza. No, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've very much enjoyed the conversation. And yeah, anyone listening, please do reach out on LinkedIn. But also, if you're in travel, best place to connect with me is probably at a Travel Massive event. This is still an industry, very much built on face-to-face connections and relationships.
So much. And this is a fairly new show. So if you've got any comments or feedback, please send it to us on email or leave comments for us. And if you've enjoyed listening to the show, please share it with your colleagues and friends. This has been Flipping the Playbook with Reza Mayende.
Flipping the Playbook is produced by SALT.agency. We don't just optimize for search and AI. We optimize for business growth across SEO content and digital PR. Check out our links in the show notes. Thanks for listening.